So this is the simple HTML form we have. So we are trying to update three properties in our object. So that's the name, the email, and the city properties. So that's what we are trying to update. Now we want to do this using JavaScript. So instead of adding my update value here myself, I want users to input that value. So just like we have on normal websites whereby it is users that interact with the website. So we have created this form so users can interact with our web page. And what we want the users to do is they should input values they want to update the object with. So we want to change the values of my object with anything the user has inputted in this form. So let's get started. The first thing we would need to do to update those values is to get the value that has been inputted by the user. So into this input fields, we need to get the value that the user has inputted. Um, so let me just clear this or comment it out. Let me comment this. Then we can start with our JavaScript code. So the first thing I want to do is get the value the user has imputed. And to do this, I would need to manipulate the DOM by calling this input field. So I want to call these input fields with their IDs. So I would need to set my ID here. So the ID here would be email. I would say email. And the last one would be city. So I would say city. So the reason why I'm doing this is so I can access what has been imputed in this input field. So if I don't have an ID, there will be no way for me to access the name input in my JavaScript. But now that I have an ID, I can say document dot get element by ID, and I would pass in my ID, which would be name. So I will do the same thing for email input, and finally for city input. So these variables are going to hold what we have in our input field for each of these inputs with their respective IDs. So the ID of this one is going to be email, and the ID of this one is going to be city. So before we move on, let me log something to the console so we can see what we are working with. So let me log name input, for example. So I'll go back to my web page, refresh this, then input a name. So let's say Smith, for example. And let me open up my console. So I can see here that I am getting my input element from my index.js file on line 26. So if I go to my line 26, you can see that I am getting the input element because I am getting that element by ID, and I'm passing in the ID for my name input element. But what I'm trying to do here is to get the value. So I would say name input dot value. So this is how I can get the value of my input. So the way I can get this value is after I have clicked on this button. But now when I click on the button, the page just refreshes, and that's because I have not added any event listener to this button. So the next step is going to be to add my form event listener. And to do this, I would need to firstly get the form. So I would say document dot query selector, and I will choose my form. I can do this because I have only one form on my web page. But if you have multiple forms, you would need to give your form an ID, and then you would get that form by its ID. So here I have only one form, so I can just get the form element, and it would store it in this variable. So now that I have my form stored in a variable, I can say form dot add event listener, and this event listener is a function that is expecting a parameter, at least a parameter, and the parameter here is going to be the submit event. So the submit event is going to happen when I click on this button. That is why I needed to add this type here. So JavaScript knows that it is going to look for a button that has the submit event on this form. So anytime I click that button, whatever I have inside of my event listener is going to get triggered. So the next parameter here is going to be my event. So let's say event. So the first parameter to my add event listener function is the type of event I want to listen for, which is the submit event in this case. Then the second parameter is going to be my function, where I'll be performing all of my actions after this event has been triggered, which is after the button has been clicked. So the first thing I want to do here is say event.prevent default. So this is just a standard, and it helps us to prevent our form from going back to the default state. So once I do that, I can then move all of my code into my event listener. So because I want this code to get executed whenever the button is clicked, so I can get the values of each of my input fields. So now that I have this, let's go back to my web page, refresh, then enter a name and click the button. So now you can see that the name I am inputting here is showing in the console, and that's because I have added an event listener for when I click this button. So when I click this button, it is going to trigger a chain of events that is starting from the beginning of this function where I have the submit event listener. And when it enters this function, it is going to get my name input, and we are logging the value of that input to the console, which is why I have Smith in my console here. So I can do the same thing for my email input and my city input. So I can get the input values of those fields from my web page. So I go back to refresh, and I can change the name, or rather I can get the name, the email, and the city. And when I click this, we can see all of that in my console. So now that we're able to get the values that we are inputting, we can modify the object that we have. So let me go back to the task. So it says we should create a simple HTML form. We've already done that. That allows users to update the person object properties. So, and the last one says we should use JavaScript to handle form submission and update the person accordingly. So the last step, we are already using JavaScript to handle form submission. So the last step is to update the person object accordingly. Sorry, just give me a minute though. So now that we are getting now that we are able to get the inputs, the values I have in my input field, we can take these values, then update the object I have using these values. So what I would need to do is, so here I can decide to uncomment this, or let me move this to after my event listener. um so let me move this here first. So I have my person object, and I am adding these properties to my person object. Now I need a function that can help me update the person based on what the user has imputed on our web page. So I can copy this and move it into my event listener. So this function is going to get called inside of the event. So that is after the user has clicked the button. So after all this, I would say console.log person. So we can see the new person object in our console. So what we simply need to do here is we need to update the field with this event. So we might not even need a function to do this because we are already inside of a function. So I can just execute this line by line. So what I just need to do here is call the person object. Then I would call the name and passing my name input dot value. So what I'm doing here is I am assigning the value that has been imputed on my web page to the name property of my person object. So just like that, we are going to be updating the person object. So here also I would have my email, then my email input dot value, then I would have my city and my city input dot value. So I can remove this, and when I go back to my web page and I refresh this, so let's change the values that we have here. So when I click update, we still have the old um the old the old values. So let's see what is happening. I am getting the name here and the city here. So something is wrong. So after getting my name input, I want to update the name field of my person by reassigning that. Let me try this other method.